Welcome to session 7 of Design Impact. We're excited to be here today and part of this whole two-day-long lineup. My name is Tom Lubke. I'm an architect and a GSD alumnus, as well as a member of the Alumni Council. I also serve as the secretary of the Commission of Fine Arts in Washington, D.C., which is the federal design review panel for the nation's capital. This is an organization you may have heard about for its involvement in the design of national memorials, museums, and other expressions of national identity in built form, which is the kind of focus that connects directly to today's session: power, equity, memory, erasure, memorials, and the making of historical narrative. So we're in interesting times. Recent debates on such political and cultural phenomena as century-old Confederate monuments or the erasure of cultural artifacts globally have put into high relief the role of memorials as a statement of hegemony, raising such questions as who controls the historic narrative? What is the purpose of commemoration? To mourn, to celebrate, to inspire, to subjugate. How is the definition of our collective identity at the individual, social group, or national level? How is this identity reinforced or challenged by a memorial? And are there new forms of commemoration, whether digital, ephemeral, changeable, that might speak more equitably to a collective experience? So we are really in a time of tremendous change, and where we are really reconsidering many public expressions of power narratives in our own country. Certainly the Black Lives Matter movement, George Floyd protests, the removal of lost cause or Confederate monuments are example of this current debate. Arguably, so was the violent Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017, or even the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. These could be seen as expressions of the same struggle for identity, symbolism, and political power. Just in the past week in Richmond, Virginia, the physical and symbolic anchor of Monument Avenue and all that it stands for, the statue of Robert E. Lee, was taken down. And a brand new memorial, the Emancipation Freedom Monument, was unveiled yesterday. These are tangible expressions of a fundamental conflict over the public assertion of authority and the historic narrative, which, while appearing to be timeless, is perhaps in fact ephemeral. So we're at a critical moment where we, as part of a design community, can also contribute to the dialogue and literally shape the way we construct these collective symbols of identity in a way that is hopefully more inclusive and equitable. So today we have a panel of 3 professionals who are involved with different perspectives on the question of commemoration as a basic feature of human culture, with examples from Antiquity through American history to the very most current moment of development of these ideas. I'll introduce these speakers in a moment as they queue up to present, and my special thanks to all of them for joining us today. Before we go there, I just want to acknowledge the work of our committee, which is within the Alumni Council that developed today's session. Christina Yu is a principal of McLean Yu Architecture and Design in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where she's associate dean of the University College of that university, as well as a faculty member of the School of Architecture and Planning. She co-chairs the ambassadorship committee within this council. I'd also like to acknowledge the tremendous contributions of our fellow committee members, Ana Pinto da Silva, who's taken on a huge role in developing the entire Design Impact program, and Peter Kuhm, under whose leadership as president of the council made this whole project possible, along with David Rubin, who will be our moderator today. These were key members of our committee that developed the focus, content, and participation of this session. And we're hoping that Anna can join us in a little while. So with that, thank you so much. You're here to answer all the questions we raised in our months of formulating this. I'm going to start with Brian Rose. C. Brian Rose is an American archaeologist, classical scholar, and author. He is the James B. Pritchard Professor of Mediterranean Archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania and the Peter Ferry Curator in charge of the Mediterranean section of the Penn Museum. He has served as president of the Archaeological Institute of America and is currently president of the American Research in Turkey, where he also directs the Gordian excavations in central Turkey and has co-directed excavations at Troy for 25 years. He serves on the board of the American Academy in Rome, or did for almost 2 decades, and received the gold medal of the Archaeological Institute of America in 2015. Brian, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your take, probably from the longest view. So with that, Brian.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Could we have the first slides, please? Thank you. I've been dealing with antiquity and obviously its connection to the modern period, in particular for the last 2 decades. And over the course of those 2 decades, since the beginning of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's been an increasing interest in viewing both conflict and the monuments that commemorate conflict, the landscapes that are molded to highlight conflict in diachronic perspective. To what extent is conflict in antiquity and the emotions, the rage, the loss associated with conflict the same now as it was 2,000, 3,000 years ago? To what extent are the monuments that commemorate the rage, the loss, the trauma in antiquity the same now as they were then? Sometimes it's easier for us to understand modern conflict by viewing it through the lens of ancient conflict, especially the Trojan War. And so you get books like Achilles in Vietnam, Odysseus in America, or Ajax in Iraq, where there's a deliberate attempt to compare the lives of soldiers in all of those modern conflicts with the lives of Greek and Trojan fighters who were part of the Trojan War. We even see spectacles that are staged primarily at universities these days called theater of war, where veterans of the wars in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan perform Greek plays of 5th century BC date that deal with the Trojan War, and they explore post-traumatic stress in antiquity during the Trojan War and post-traumatic stress in Iraq and Afghanistan. What about war memorials in antiquity? To what extent are they the same as what we're doing now? To what extent is the landscape treatment the same? Let's start with the war memorial at the end, near the end of the Persian Wars, 490 BC, the mound of Marathon, northeast of Athens in Greece. This is a monument that contains the bodies of the 192 Athenians who fell in the Battle of Marathon against the Persians in the course of a 20-year-long Persian War. Rather than surround the mound that contains the bodies with figural sculpture, they surrounded it with stone slabs on which were written the names of those who had died. So the only decoration of the mound were the casualty lists of those who died there. Obviously, one doesn't have to look very far in the modern period to see the connections with modern war memorials. So an abstract form with names constituting the names of those who had fallen, constituting the only type of decoration. That's a description of the Vietnam War Memorial, just as it is a description of the World Trade Center Memorial, with the names being dominant in the decoration rather than images. Are we at a point where we can use images anymore in war memorials? I tend to think of the Kent State shootings in 1970, where 4 students were shot by the US National Guard. How do you commemorate such an act, such a loss, in images, in figural decoration? When the trustees of Kent State decided that they needed to do it, they hired the sculptor George Siegel to oversee the decoration, to oversee the figural commemoration. And what he put together was a group of Abraham and Isaac, as you see on the right. So again, trying to express a sense of loss in the modern period by using elements or figures from antiquity. This was too much, this biblical analogy, for the trustees of Kent State, and they rejected it, sending the sculptures of Abraham and Isaac to Princeton University, which is where they're now located. And in the end, they opted for the same solution as the designers of the Marathon Memorial or the World Trade Center Memorial or Maya Lin and the Vietnam Memorial, a list of the names of the students who had died. What about religion? How do you express loss of a religious figure in antiquity, and how do you do it today? Or is it still done today? To explore that, I take you to the site of which I'm the director, the site of Gordian in West Central Turkey, which was the city of King Midas of the Golden Touch, and also the home of the great mother goddess of Asia Minor, Matar or Cybele. Some of you know the Magna Mater and her temple on the southwest corner of the Palatine in Rome. Throughout the landscape that's associated with the great mother goddess, there are empty thrones, and you see one of them in lower right, steps leading up to a throne. And empty thrones in particular, because this was a mystery cult, so there was a dying and rising god who was worshipped. You see that in the figural decoration of her temples, where the priests will carry an empty throne to symbolize the death of an agent in the cult and the subsequent resurrection of that agent in the cult. And you have that, of course, with other mystery religions as well, the most famous example of which is Christianity. And I'm taking you to Ravenna on the right, where you see the empty throne of Christ. Again, a dying and rising God symbolized by means of the empty throne. Do we still do that today? We do. Oklahoma City. What sort of design solution would be appropriate for Oklahoma City? Obviously, the names of those who died in the bombing in 1994, that goes without saying. Is any other component of the design scheme appropriate to commemorate what had happened there? The designers in the end used the motif of the empty throne or the empty chair, symbolizing in essence the triumph of the spirit, which is really no different from what was done in antiquity, both in the cult of the great mother goddess and the cult of Christianity. Obviously, we've seen in the course of the last 2 decades, the eradication of so much ancient culture, an attempt to edit history, to remove monuments that date prior to the beginning of the dominance of Islam, so prior to the 7th century AD. And you're seeing several examples of that on the screen. I'm showing you the bombing of Palmyra in upper left and the destruction of the statues in the Mosul Museum in northern Iraq on the right. Again, a kind of editing of history. Of course, the most famous example of this is at Bamiyan in central Afghanistan, where the Taliban tied dynamite to the shoulders and ankles of 2 giant Buddhas in the cliffs there, dating to the 6th century AD, and completely destroyed them, so that now one sees the shell once occupied by the Buddha, as well as a shadow of the form that it once represented. There's, of course, been a great deal of discussion about what to do in this area, and it's a very different kind of discussion now that the Taliban, again, control the area. Should it be left as an empty shell? Should there be some sort of holographic reconstruction of the Buddha? This filled panels on historic preservation for the last 2 decades, and it's almost a moot point now, because what is there now, which is the empty shell, and perhaps the most powerful memorial to what had happened there in iconoclasm, that is not going to change now that the Taliban controls the area. Design schemes to the destruction of cultural heritage, design schemes that commemorate the destruction of cultural heritage are never easy. In Antiquity, after the Persian destruction of the Athenian Acropolis in 480, the Parthenon, the first Parthenon, was destroyed, and the Athenians decided to leave it as a ruin for 30 years. Intending the ruin to commemorate the barbarity of the Persians, who would destroy the most sacred component of the city. It was only after 30 years that they decided to build a temple even more elaborate than the first one. And this was a design solution that was suggested to those who oversaw the monument commemorating the World Trade Center bombings, should one leave it as a deliberate ruin, as was done with the Parthenon. In the end, they chose not to do that. The building was dissected like the relic of a saint and distributed to different cities throughout the nation. Each piece of the World Trade Center became a monument to commemorate the act unto itself. And it is very much like an early medieval relic, where the saints' bodies were dismembered, and even arms and legs and feet were cut up into small pieces, each one of which possessed the same level of power as the larger piece from which it was cut. In a sense, the World Trade Center pieces are our relics for the 21st century in the landscape. There's also been a great deal of discussion about dictator statues, and that obviously ties into history. What do you remember? What do you forget? We've seen the statues of Saddam Hussein fall in Iraq. We've seen the statues of Lenin and Stalin fall in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. And we've seen plenty of other dictator statues removed from the landscape. One of the more egregious examples being on the screen on lower right, you see the colossal head of Ferdinand Marcos on a cliff in the Philippines at the left, and then the same image on the right after the eyes had been bombed following Marcos's fall. There's an interesting example of this in Baghdad. I did a lot of cultural heritage training for the soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, and went to Baghdad and to southern Iraq as well as southern Afghanistan to do the training. And this is the Victory Arch in the center of Baghdad. What you have are two giant hands cast from the actual hands of Saddam Hussein, holding swords that cross over a triumphal parade ground. And the hands are surrounded by helmets that are helmets captured from the Iranians whom the Iraqis fought in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War. Those helmets have been embedded in concrete on the triumphal path that crosses underneath the swords. And you see that happening on lower left. The helmets actually embedded in the concrete so that you as a victorious Iraqi soldier would literally walk on the helmets of the Iranians whom you have defeated. So you're walking on the heads of your enemy as a trigger to memory, with sound and touch being just as important as sight. Those hands are cast directly from the hands of Saddam Hussein. And so there's been iconoclasm there. You look at one of the hands before iconoclasm at the left, and then after part of the hands were taken down at the right. because those hands were individualized, they weren't generic hands. And so in 2003, the hands were attacked, and it became a danger to passersby who were walking along the triumphal procession. Just as spoliation, the removal of pieces of buildings in early Christian Constantinople became a danger to passersby in that city as well, and that yielded our first historic preservation laws. In this case, the US Armed Forces stopped the iconoclasm, fencing the arms because it was dangerous to anyone who would walk through the area. I dealt with this in particular in southern Iraq with the so-called House of Abraham, which Saddam Hussein had built from scratch in 1999 to try to attract the Pope during the Vatican's Jubilee year of 2000. The Iraqi archaeological supervisor wanted to tear it down because it was an instrument of political propaganda. I argued that it was now part of the archaeological site, which had been used in the service of political propaganda, and that it should stay intact, albeit with explanatory signs around it that indicated how archaeology had been co-opted and forced to serve as a piece of propaganda in the political scheme of Saddam Hussein. As of now, it still stands, but there are plans to destroy it. We've obviously seen this in our own country. What do we do about the Confederate statues in the South? Do we leave them erect? Do we take them down and put them in a museum, or should they be destroyed? These are the same sorts of questions that were asked in Antiquity, with monuments to the emperors in particular, but also monuments to kings and tyrants in Greece who had fallen from favor. So the questions associated with historicizing the landscape and the cityscape have really changed very little since Antiquity. What do we choose to remember? What do we choose to forget? Do we use words or images as memory triggers, or a combination of both? And to what extent should history be edited for a new generation? Or in other words, what sort of future should there be for the past? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We're gonna now, with those thoughts about giving us a kind of a broad, I think that an interesting takeaway, of course, is how these themes are transcend a kind of a cultural context and one of centuries. Our next speaker is Del Upton. Del is the Distinguished Research Professor of Architectural History at UCLA and a Professor Emeritus of Architecture at the University of California at Berkeley. He earned his PhD and MA in American Civilization at Brown University and a BA in History and English at Colgate University. His books, and they are award-winning, include Another City, Urban Life and Urban Spaces in the New American Republic, 2008, What Can't Be Said, Race, Uplift, and Monument Building in the Contemporary South from 2015, and American Architecture, A Thematic History. This is recently published 2019. He was a 2019 resident of the American Academy in Rome, and last year was the Kress-Beinecke Professor at the Center for Advanced Study of the Visual Arts, or CASVA, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Del. We look forward to your treatment of the topic in probably in American, specifically American terms. Del.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you all for having me. If we could have the first slide, please. I take my role here to be that of the modern historian, but I want to stress that most of the things that I have to say today really have been true of Euro-American statues since antiquity, and you got some sense of that from Brian's presentation. And since I have a short time, I want to sidestep the kinds of wheel-spinning, repetitive arguments that have paralyzed current discussions of monuments, especially Confederate ones. But what I do want to do is focus on the kinds of monuments that have stirred the most controversy. So to dispose of the repetitive arguments, are monuments history in some abstracted, reified way? No. Are Confederate monuments, among others, profoundly and usually explicitly racist? The answer to that is yes. These are settled questions, despite what the blather you hear in the public sphere and popular media. How can we break out of the morass then and think about monuments in a more general way and in ways that are more fruitful? And I want to offer you three forms of means of observation that I hope will stimulate discussion. And the first is that for the most part, in the vast majority of cases, the kinds of monuments that are the objects of protest and controversy today are statues, figures of human beings, statues that have attributes. And you should always look at all the details of a statue. Attributes that are meant to inflect our perception of the person depicted, to create an impression. So rather than being history statues, we might consider to be more like sound bites. But the important thing is that statues are in very critical senses people. They're sometimes idealized people. They're sometimes imagined people if we don't know what the person looked like. But in many cases, particularly modern cases, great stress is placed on the need for the statue to look as much like the person represented as possible. And down to the present, you have controversies arising over whether the statue really looks like the person. And this is particularly endemic to Martin Luther King statues these days. They really look like Martin Luther King. But also, and this is equally important, is statues stand in for a person who is not there, who's removed in time and place. So they're surrogates. As surrogates, they collect the praise of the condemnation that their models would receive if they're present. So it's important when we think about statues and monuments, and you got a little bit of this from Brian talking about the triumphal monument in Baghdad. It's important to pay attention to what happens around them. For example, the rites and rituals of dedication and celebration that accumulate around statues. And so here we have a living flag at the Robert E. Lee statue, the one that was just taken down a couple of weeks ago. A Confederate, this is not a dedication ceremony, but it's a ceremony that happened 20 years after the statue went up, celebration of the Confederacy. And on the bottom, you have school children gathered around the statue of a man named John McDonough, who was a very rich New Orleans merchant. He died in 1850, and he left money to create public schools in New Orleans. He also said in his will that every year the school children of New Orleans should gather around his grave and sing songs of praise to him, not because he needed praise, but because they needed to learn gratitude. This ceremony was transferred to his statue in front of City Hall, and it happened every year until there was an enormous protest in the 1950s by Black people who were offended that their students had to arrive early, wait for the white children, stand in back, and do their part after everyone else had finished. So in both of these cases, the human being is praised through praise for the statue. And it's also worth noting that it always seems to be children and young women who have to be the priests and priestesses of these rites, who have to carry them out. So the Jefferson flag is all made up of school children. As surrogate human beings, statues can be made to talk. They can have a voice. Pasquino, whom you see on the right, one of several such statues, ancient statues that were recovered, many during the Renaissance, set up like Pasquino was, and then people would attach satires, criticisms, and so on to them, so that the statues became the surrogates who could say things that people couldn't say, but also as relics of antiquity of the Roman establishment, statues became surrogates for the power structure, so that these kinds of notes, which are still attached, as you can see on the far right, these kinds of notes became, Pasquino became an interlocutor between ordinary people and the people in charge. But statues can also absorb, as surrogates, they absorb vitriol, they absorb ridicule that would otherwise be directed at the subject. The Duke of Wellington in Glasgow, a reminder of the British domination of Scotland, has in recent years adopted a traffic cone, as he says. Sometimes his horse wears one too. And the city tried to ban this, but it was so popular that it's become a permanent feature of the statue. So this kind of ridicule punctures the kind of inflated grandiosity that the monumental scale of the statue and the equestrian pose and the ostensibly permanent materials give it. One of the best examples of this is Napoleon. When the Vendôme statue was proposed after the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon was nervous about having his image on the top of it. He wrote, "I do not want idols, not even statues out of doors. If I fail in my ventures, it's preferable that there should not be any statues exposed to the criticism of the world. I do not want homages or of flattery, and like Louis XIV, a statue exposed to public derision." And in fact, over the course of the 19th century, Napoleon's statue was removed repeatedly. It was removed by the Bourbon Restoration government and replaced with the Bourbon flag. It was replaced again after the 1830 revolution, replaced a couple of more times. In 1871, during the Commune, a crowd led by Gustave Courbet, the painter, pulled it down altogether. It was reconstructed after that by the reactionary government that followed. It's important to see this kind of destruction as part of an intrinsic part of the lifeblood of life history of statues. It's not mindless vandalism, but it's as much a ritual as dedication or celebration around statues. And it's very simple as it's a triumph over power. And when I saw this picture of Courbet and the mob standing around the fallen statue of Napoleon in the Place Vendôme, I immediately thought of things like the pictures you see of loggers standing on the enormous logs that they've toppled. The contrast of scale, posing beside the thing that you have destroyed, a much larger thing than you, suggests the meaning of this kind of destruction. Also, once you've done that, is the issue of punishment. Punishment of the statue as a surrogate for the person. Fire, the fires of hell, obviously, attacking the eternal, durable materials of a statue. The Emperor Tiberius's henchman Sejanus, Albert Pike, who you see here in Washington, was toppled and burned last year. Jefferson Davis in Richmond, Columbus in Richmond. The burning of these supposedly non-combustible statues suggests internal punishment, and it also suggests, like the people standing beside the fallen log, that these powerful figures are not that powerful. Or the selection of other appropriate materials. Edward Colston, the slave trader in Bristol, who made his money through the overseas trade in slaves, was thrown into the river. Christopher Columbus, as you can see here in Richmond, after he was set on fire, was thrown into Bird Lake. And a Richmond humor magazine had the headline, "Columbus discovers bottom of Bird Lake." So the second point is that monuments, like buildings, are parts of mixed landscapes that are essential to their meaning. That is, it's not only what the monument looks like, but where it's put. So after the end of Reconstruction, when Confederate loyalists could, we might say, come out from under federal scrutiny, they put statues in front of courthouses, Confederate monuments in front of courthouses, as a way of asserting their control of the instruments of power. Or this statue of John C. Calhoun, who was an antebellum ardent defender of slavery. His most notorious statement was that slavery was a positive good, not the unfortunate necessary evil that most defenders called it. His statue was put in front of, and the original footstone was literally, foundation rather, was laid literally right directly in front of the building you see in the back. The Citadel, an institution formed in response to the Denmark-Vesey slave conspiracy. So by associating Calhoun with the Citadel conveyed the message that the defense of, since Calhoun's statue didn't get built until after the Civil War, the message that the racial hierarchies of the pre-Civil War days were still valued and would be enforced in late 19th century Charleston. Finally, and most important, and particularly in view of the events of last year, many people were surprised that protests over a police murder of George Floyd in Minnesota would involve attacks on Confederate monuments. And even more surprised that these attacks should spread to include attacks on a wide variety of monuments, up to and including monuments of such supposedly good people as Lincoln and Grant. It's less hard to understand if we understand that monuments also relate to all other monuments. They create a kind of commemorative constellation that articulates in the US, but not only in the US, a particular nationalist mythology. Most of the monuments under attack were created in the period between the end of Reconstruction and Depression. They sketch a story of the creation of a white America by enterprising Euro-American pioneers, in quotes, industrialists, by valiant Civil War soldiers on both sides, so Confederate monuments are part of this constellation, by the suppression of bad Indians. George Rogers Clark in the upper right is terrorizing the Indians of the Ohio Territory with aid of good Indians like Lawrence, whom you see in the bottom right, who alerted the settlers at Schenectady to an attack from the French coming from Quebec. And largely, the one group that's really absent from these are African Americans. So I don't want to say that this is organized propaganda, but it results from the widespread credence to this national myth by people who had the power to put up monuments. As the historian Eric Hobsbawm wrote in his book about nationalism, nationalism requires too much belief in what patently is not so. So one way to see this international campaign tide of statue destruction in the last year and a half is as an equally uncoordinated, usually unarticulated, disaffection with the nationalist mythology by those who have always been present, but now have the power to make themselves heard. So it's in a sense, not an attack on Confederate monuments per se, not an attack on Lincoln or Grant, but it's a questioning of the entire American nationalist myth, and implicitly a demand to start over. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That was fascinating, and it leads us also not only the whole program of revisiting these commemorative questions, but also their form and the inherited form of the statue. Our next speaker may be able to talk a little bit about that question of where is the future of this. Justin Garrett Moore is the next speaker. He is the program officer for the Humanities in Place program at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, where his work focuses on advancing equity, inclusion, and social justice through place-based initiatives and programs, built environments, cultural heritage projects, and commemorative spaces and landscapes. He is currently working, this is a great connection here, he's currently working on developing the Foundation's monument project, which he will tell us more about in his presentation. He is the former executive director of the New York City Public Design Commission, where he spearheaded initiatives to address social equity and sustainability through improved built environment design and public processes. In 2021, he received the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Architecture, and he was appointed to the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts by President Biden. And so I actually have the pleasure of having him working for him as a member of the board that I manage. So, Justin, we look forward to your comments. Welcome.
Great. Thank you, Tom, and thank you for the invitation to speak. And a big thanks to both Brian and Dell for this really important and context and background for all of this work. So first slide, please. So good afternoon. The Mellon Foundation launched the Monuments Project last fall. It is a 5-year, $250 million initiative to reshape America's commemorative landscape. I joined the Mellon Foundation in December, and in addition to leading the new Humanities in Place program, I partner with the Foundation's president, Dr. Elizabeth Alexander, and her team on the Monuments Project. Monuments and memorials catalyze us to understand our history and have the power to enrich our multivocal democracy. Today, our public realm disproportionately venerates a limited few and overlooks the multitudes of people who have made and shaped our society. This failure to represent and honor our multiplicity impacts how we perceive, distribute, and demonstrate power in the United States, as well as it limits the breadth of our knowledge and understanding. By transforming our nation's commemorative landscape, we can create public spaces that memorialize the compelling stories of those outside of conventional power so that our collective histories are more completely and accurately represented. Over time, this will continue to critically shift civic power and will produce knowledge, understanding, inspiration, and ultimately more fruitful coexistence in strengthened communities. Through the Monuments Project, we seek to first facilitate broader expressions of the powerful multiplicity and complexity of American stories. Second, foster multivocal participation in the shaping of our national and commemorative landscape. And third, deepen public engagement with more accurate collective histories in order to build shared understanding. We are considering these goals when exploring potential grants and projects and pursuing them through different approaches that have been developed through consultation with a wide range of thinkers, artists, and scholars and historians since the project's launch. These activities that we will support will generally include creating new monuments or memorials envisioned broadly, supporting the relocation or removal of a monument in the context of reparative actions that are part of a holistic vision for a particular site or context, contextualizing existing monuments or memorials, and producing scholarship and cultural artifacts to inform public understanding of how commemorative landscapes communicate, shape, and instruct our history, and finally producing research and other information to support commemorative work. So the red dots on this map show the monuments-related grants by the Mellon Foundation from 2018 to 2020, including grants that were made really in the same vein preceding the Monuments Project. This includes things like the restoration of the Watts Towers out in California, or the National Memorial to Peace and Justice in Alabama. And these are really in the context of the foundation's broader shift in work toward connecting its role as an arts and humanities funder to connect that to issues of social justice. But since the Monuments Project's launch last year, we've supported new projects, and they're all across the country, and I'll share a few of those with you this afternoon. So one recent grant is to US ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites. The organization focuses on the preservation of historic sites and the conservation of cultural heritage. Their longstanding work includes research and advocacy for monuments and cultural resource landscapes. In addressing controversial monuments, such as the removal of the J. Marion Sims statue in New York, shown here, often requires complex legal and public processes. But most states and local jurisdictions do not have specific or up-to-date guidance or policies related to monuments. With Mellon's support, US ICOMOS will work with public officials and policymakers, parks and public sites administrators, historians and cultural heritage experts, and other stakeholders to develop a monument removal, relocation, and reinterpretation toolkit. The toolkit will build on existing networks and partnerships with the National Park Service, the US Conference of Mayors, and other advocacy organizations. This national effort would identify and promote practices and processes for making decisions about the display, interpretation, removal, or relocation of monuments associated specifically with oppression and controversy. The toolkit will include a global survey of existing work and policies, case studies around specific monuments, recommendations for developing monuments task forces, new policy guides, and online publications and events to share the toolkit. Another Monuments Project grant will support an effort by the National Capital Planning Commission, or NCPC, in Washington, D.C. to reimagine the commemorative landscape in our nation's capital. The NCPC is the federal government's planning agency and is involved in memorial planning and design, but it has not fully examined the potential for temporary commemoration. Shown here is one notable temporary memorial, the Names Project's AIDS quilt, installed on the National Mall in 1987. With social and environmental change marking this generation, it is an opportune time to understand who and what the public would like to see commemorated in our national landscape, expand who and what is represented, and explore new models for how commemoration takes shape. The importance and power of temporary commemorations were recently revealed by the COVID-19 memorial earlier this year. 400 lights around the Lincoln Memorial's reflecting pool were lit to honor the then 400,000 people in the US who had died from COVID-19 through January 2021. The simple but powerful installation marked a moment of shared loss, transition, and unity for the nation. The NCPC will work with partners like the National Park Service, the Trust for the National Mall, the NEA, the NEH, and the Smithsonian to create new models for temporary commemorative works that expands and celebrates national and local stories within the Capitol. Mellon funding will support the overall project coordination and public engagement efforts, as well as the installation of several temporary, built, and ephemeral commemorations with varying scales and complexities on the National Mall and at more prototypical sites throughout the district. The installations will be developed around multiple themes and create opportunities for public input. The results of this pilot will be evaluated and recommendations incorporated into the NCPC's monuments planning work. Best practices from the project would also be shared with other cities. In Memphis, we find the opportunity to explore how minor stories can be given major honor. With Mellon funding, artist Theaster Gates, in collaboration with park designers Kate Orff and Jeannie Gang, will create a new multi-part work that honors Tom Lee, an African-American river worker who in 1925 heroically rescued 32 white engineers and their families from drowning in the Mississippi River. 2 memorials honoring Lee have already marked the site. One, a now removed obelisk labeling Tom Lee, quote, a very worthy Negro, and the other, shown here, is a newer figurative statue depicting the rescue. Theaster Gates' installation for Tom Lee Park is titled A Monument to Listening. The new commemorative landscape seeks to create opportunities for dialogue and healing among Memphians and visitors. The installation is an anti-monument that is activated by the experience of park visitors. The installation is composed of 32 bronze sculptures representing Tom Lee and the lives that he saved. Situated at the heart of a series of multi-level walking paths, the installation creates the possibility for a series of formal, semi-formal, and informal activations. The anti-monument would also be activated programmatically through community-led walks, spoken word and poetry performances, and a silent march through the park. The project will incorporate points of origin at nearby sites of historic significance, such as the National Civil Rights Museum in the Lorraine Mortel and Claiborne Temple. Trained and compensated community members will lead guided walks from those points of origin toward the Mississippi River, to and through Tom Lee Park, and to A Monument to Listening. By placing visitors' experiences at the heart of the installation, the people become the celebrated while creating spaces for connection, informal dialogue, and reflection. Also with Mellon support is the North Carolina Freedom Park, which will create a new monument and commemorative landscape. The new park will honor the African-American experience and the ongoing struggle for freedom in North Carolina and elsewhere. It will offer a place for school children, visitors, residents, citizens, and policymakers to learn about the contributions African-Americans have made toward achieving a better society for all, and reflecting upon the importance of full freedom and the sanctity of justice and equality for every citizen. This aerial view of the site shows how the proposed Freedom Park, which is outlined in yellow, will be situated within the city among important sites such as the Governor's Mansion, the State Archives, the General Assembly, Museum of History, and the State Capitol and its commemorative landscape. This Capitol landscape includes monuments, Confederate monuments, and the former sites of removed Confederate monuments, which are shown in red on this diagram. In June 2020, following Black Lives Matter protests galvanized by the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper ordered 3 Confederate monuments removed from the state capitol grounds, including a 75-foot tall North Carolina State Confederate monument. And this is an important context for this project. Nearby in the new Freedom Park, a new monument designed by the late African-American architect Phil Freelon and continued by Zena Howard beautifully enriches North Carolina's public realm and commemorative landscape. At the center of the park is the Beacon of Freedom, a sculptural anchor to the park that represents hope, struggle, and aspiration. The inscribed landscape walls express hidden stories from the past and reveal the roots of slavery and freedom, humanity and inhumanity, and democracy and its denial. The planted landscape provides space for respite as well as garden areas for gatherings and public events. Dr. John Hope Franklin was one of the founding members of this important project, which began over 20 years ago. He stated, "The goal is a public art tribute to the freedom as expressed through the African-American experience. It will be a continuing reminder of the struggles for freedom and how much more we need to do to achieve equity and justice in our society." It is an important charge for this project and for our collective work. So I'll share one last example. Many may be familiar with the Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson windows at the Washington National Cathedral. The stained glass windows shown here and stone tablets installed at the cathedral in the 1950s were funded by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They lionize Confederate generals Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, and complete with images of the Confederate battle flag. With Mellon's support, the cathedral's plan for a thoughtful removal and recontextualization of the windows will be joined by reparative actions that include commissioning new stained glass windows and creating opportunities for critical dialogues on race, symbolism, and social justice at this site of national and institutional power. Esteemed artist Carrie James Marshall has agreed to take on this important commission. Marshall is known for his adroit engagement as an artist with history, symbolism, race, color, beauty, and Blackness. His talent presents an incredible opportunity to reset the subjects and narratives and the colors and light that the cathedral and its stained glass windows would hold and project. Mellon and Ford Foundation funding will also support events at the cathedral to facilitate heightened and sharpened public discourse about who we are as a nation and broaden who participates in shaping the telling of our shared history. And this is the last image. Lastly, as a part of the Mellon's Monument Project, Philadelphia-based Monument Lab undertook a comprehensive audit of our country's commemorative landscape. And so there's going to be an event September 29th at 4 p.m. Eastern that you can check out. And you can find that and register at monumentalconversations.splashthat.com. And thank you.
Thank you, Justin. And moving forward now, we are going to introduce our moderators, and we're going to do as quickly as possible. We've got actually two. We've got Allah Hamid will be participating in this session as the student moderator. She's currently pursuing a master's degree in design studies, art design in the public domain from the GSD. She's received a Bachelor of Engineering and Architecture from her home country of Sudan, as well as a dual master's in architecture and landscape from the University of New Mexico. She has teaching and studio experience, and her interests are in interdisciplinary design, social justice, and humanitarian relief. And quickly, David Rubin is our main moderator. He is the founding principal of David Rubin Land Collective, a landscape architecture, urban design, and planning studio committed to practice with an emphasis on socially purposeful design strategies. His contribution to the field is in empathy-driven design, a hallmark of the studio, earning increasing renown for fusing issues of social justice in cities with excellence in the design of public spaces. He has taught and lectured at institutions such as the GSD, the Pennsylvania School of Design, SciArc. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Rome and of the American Society of Landscape Architects. And without further ado, David, come on, and you are now on board to moderate this amazing topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. It is my honor to be present with these extraordinary participants. I know personally Brian, and I appreciate his breadth of knowledge in both experience and time. And I have becoming better known with Justin and with Del, and significantly appreciate their perspective. One of the things that I think is most fascinating about this topic is that memorials and monuments typically live in landscape. They live in the contextual tissue of our society. It is aspirationally the most equitable of our design disciplines because it has the capacity to uplift all, but landscape is inherently political in construct and reflective of culture. So oftentimes it is those leaders of our society or other societies that have the capacity to inform, positively or negatively, the narrative that is shared, that is representative of that culture. This changed in the context of Enlightenment somewhat, in that there was the voice of the people, but we are inherently habitual characters as human beings. We tend to fall back on what is easy and the biases that we all bring to our own experiences and the culture we intend to represent. One of the most fascinating aspects of the discipline that I love so much, which is landscape, is that it is a palimpsest. It exists in time both as a static system and a living system. It is inherently political. It has the capacity to be written and read by many. And so that symbolic reading becomes important, as we heard from Del, as we heard from Brian, as we heard from Justin, in who writes, who rewrites the unwritten, and who then has the capacity to co-write these landscapes. And in particular, as we heard from Justin, the notion of equity in the context of what gets written and what gets read is ever more important, particularly when polarization is so much a part of our political landscape. So with that, I want to start just briefly with Brian, because I invited Brian to become a participant in this, knowing him so well and having heard him speak. the thing that resonates with me when I listen to that narrative is that human beings are habitual. We cannot help ourselves but fall into the same easy construct. And that, as Brian pointed out, nothing is new. We have been doing this for quite some time. And I guess, Brian, one of the things that I wanted to hear from you is perhaps your appreciation or your understanding of the sociology of this very human construct of memorialization, of monumentality. I think the most compelling thing for me, one aspect of your presentation was not just that the Athenian memorial was an objectified mound. The monument to 9/11 is a void in the landscape, and yet they were both surrounded by names of those that perished. Can you reflect a little bit about this, the nature of you have the longest lens, right? You have this extraordinary lens in that spectrum. Can you just wax a bit on what you see in that?
Yeah, in spite of the fact that technology has changed so dramatically over the course of the last 2 millennia, human nature has not. We are fundamentally the same now as we were then. And you can see that in programs such as Theater of War, where people, soldiers, veterans who suffer from post-traumatic stress as a consequence of their service in Iraq and Afghanistan, that post-traumatic stress is no different from what Ajax experienced on the battlefield during the Trojan War. People today commit suicide as Ajax committed suicide. And that's why the Theater of War programs are so resonant in so many parts of the States, because the experience of the Homeric warrior has become a part of the cure for post-traumatic stress in the 21st century. Just understanding that this trauma is not restricted to them, but has been going on for 3 millennia. And you see that by the same token in the designs of the monuments that commemorate the war and the loss. I use the example of the mound and the names and the empty chairs, but there are a whole host of similar designs that one could cite, again, indicating that there is essentially no difference between what was happening then at 2,000, 3,000 years ago and what's happening now. The difference is, if I think of Rome, which is my specialty, with a Roman memorial, they would show victor and vanquished, conqueror and conquered. We don't do that anymore. We haven't done it, I think, since the Civil War. I'm not sure if there are monuments from World War I that actually, public sculpture in parks that show a victor and vanquished. Normally it's a monument that focuses only on the side of the dedicator of the monument. You see the soldiers associated with the dedicator of the monument rather than an actual battle commemorated. That does separate us from ancient Rome, but by and large, I see the same designs repeated over and over again over the course of 2 millennia.
This speaks to the limited vision of the human entity, right? It's actually that as individuals in our society, we only have the capacity to see within our lifetimes. It's why I personally advocate that every government, mayoral, state governor, or president should have a historian in their council, because we do repeat ourselves. We are habitual by nature. There is the act of repeat, oftentimes not of elevation. And so, Del, I guess the next question would be from your perspective, and I do invite any participant to reflect as well. But what I found fascinating about your description was this aspect of statuary as idealization, as representation. It has translated over time into something specifically more realistic of the individual, but that idealization is inherent in this sort of placing that individual on a throne, quite literally, standing up above us, larger than life, a significant feature, something that we should commemorate. What is fascinating is that there's praise and reverence, but there's change over time in the context of that interpretation, as you say, because things are in fashion and go out of fashion. We have time allows us to see more broadly, as Brian has referenced. And so ideas about that reverence change quite significantly. So how do, the thing for me is, the other aspect of this is what you referenced was a level of mythology. I wrote down as you were speaking that this is Jungian mythology, and then you referenced mythology. It is truly inherent in our nature that we would want to have some aspect of praise, and then what I wrote down is the commemorative constellation. And then you come back to this aspect of nationalism and that reverence where it can go awry, right? The notion of memorialization and idealization then becomes quite challenging for many. If it's written typically by the oppressor. And so we have to rethink over time who was excluded. How do we rewrite? How do we co-write? As I said, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are and sort of questioning of the American myth in that context.
That's a huge question. First thing I would say, I guess, is that perhaps it's not completely helpful to think about when we think about particular monuments and creating monuments and the monumental landscape that we have, not to think about it in terms of a universal human nature, but in terms of the particular circumstances that bring about particular novels. And I'm sorry, I've got this dry throat today. All of the monuments that we looked at were put up by someone, even though they may have, the fiction is that we all admire this person and we have put up a monument to him, or less often her. In fact, it's usually that person's friends who admire the person and have the power to get it put up, get the monument put up, and demand a kind of reverence for it. The other thing that I would say that kind of undercuts the notion of universality is that, from the point of view I've just stated, monuments are a tool. You put them up to accomplish something. You put them up to say, we're in charge, or some other message. But what happens is that eventually, in a particular context, people realize that monuments are a very blunt tool. So we, in this country, we've gone through 2 intense periods of monument building. The one that I mentioned, from basically the end of Reconstruction to the Depression. But what happens at the end of that is people start to say, well, monuments don't do anything. They usually talk about it in terms of usefulness. So why don't we have useful monuments? Which is why in many countries and many counties and states in the US, you have veterans memorial auditoriums and things like that. Those are reactions against statuary monuments. Then with the creation of the Vietnam Memorial in a particular national context of growing division and inequality, everyone wanted again to get on the monument bandwagon. And I think what's happening now is that the reaction against monuments, the attacks on monuments and so on, are the 21st century version of saying monuments don't really do what we hoped they would do. They're not really as useful a tool as we thought that we need to do something else. So despite the fact that we have these big patterns, and I would agree with Brian that the basic patterns of monument building and monument unbuilding have continued for 2,500 years, you always have to look at the particular circumstance and the particular setting. And so when I see like the new monuments that Justin is talking about, I think, how long will these be relevant? Tom said at the beginning, monuments are ephemera, and I believe that. The pretext is that they're forever, but they've always been ephemeral. They've always come and gone. and then they go through dormant periods with the Confederate monuments, dormant periods when no one pays attention to them. Then something changes, and everyone is looking at them and say, "Hey, what is this that we've been living with?" So it's a very, very active and constantly changing kind of situation. And you're right, it really does depend on the landscape is a critical part of it.
So this is a perfect segue for me to connect with Justin on, as well as Brian and Del, but also to ask the audience to ask questions and for Allah to help facilitate that in just a moment. But Justin, Del gives a great segue for you at the and your work at the Mellon organization. I was taken very much by among all of your comments, two things in particular. One is the representation of the AIDS quilt in the context of the National Mall, and then the COVID memorial. And as someone who works with the National Park Service on a regular basis, particularly at the mall, it is this sort of extraordinarily democratized experience that I find fascinating. And as a gay man myself who found identity in the context of the AIDS crisis when I was young, I am living through my second global viral pandemic in that context. And so it is a breadth of history in my own lifetime to see the mall commemorated, focusing on that, the abstract affliction. No one is safe in the context of that impact. It knows no boundaries in that. And then to see in your descriptions the monument to listening, which I found fascinating because, as you said, people become the celebrated. It is not, it's turning the mirror back to society and saying, this is a celebration of us in breadth. So my question to you is, what is equity in the context of memorial when bias is inherent within the human condition? We cannot help ourselves but look through a specific lens of singular experience. So how do you get to the collective consciousness in that breadth of monument?
Yeah, thank you. And I definitely sort of appreciate and agree with Del and Brian's points about the nature of ephemerality, temporality. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why we were so interested in the NCPC's I think recognition that we don't have great tools to acknowledge that in how we think about and design our landscapes. And there are these inherent inequities and power dynamics that are constructed around the ways in which conventional forms of monument building, whether it's a statue or an auditorium or a very beautifully designed landscape intervention, are still beholden to certain structures of power and balance that have largely not represented and reflected the broader society. And I think more people understand and recognize that that is the case. And it's sort of, can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools conversation, in that we have to find other ways to think about how we inhabit space, how are we together in space, what are the ways that we sort of have interaction. And so there's a lot of conversation about modality, about process, about what are different ways, frankly, outside of, that kind of arc of like the Western, from antiquity to today through a particular lens approach to some of these questions. And so I think in many of the projects, we're actually interested in the how more than sort of the form that probably comes across when you present, right? There are all these different forms that show up, or different kind of different types of evidence of that power shift, but we are actually interested in the how that produced them. And so actually the Freedom Monument project that I showed, that's the result of 20 years of advocacy by a group of Black people to get a public landscape that was for them in their capital, right? And that was an incredible process. think of all the meetings, all the conversations, and so much of the work was actually that process as much as it is kind of the experienced public landscape, because that process becomes a part of, a certain time frame of memory and engagement and understanding for people. So I think people are starting to understand and acknowledge that is something that we're not very good at, frankly, right? It's much easier to, put somebody on a pedestal or make a space and name it. It's very, like they're showing, like we've been doing this for a long time, right? People know how to do that, but it hasn't actually been working as well as we might hope.
That's a stunning response, because what it makes me think of as an individual in the context of a collective consciousness, the society that I live in, and perhaps each of us can reflect it with our own lens. I am made up of all the good things and bad things that happened in my life, right? So is our society. And I'm reflecting upon Dell's quote of nationalism requires a latent belief in what is not so. And we've just gone through a period, and hopefully, actually, we probably still are in a period of alternate facts. But what's fascinating is that the reaction is the work that you're doing in the context of, and that others are doing in the context of rewriting, co-writing, recognizing the opposite of that lens is this other thing that is very difficult to deal with, but incredibly important to the society that we want to hold dear, which is made up of diversity. Just like any economic portfolio, the more diverse a community is, a society is, the more resilient it is to change and to uplift. With that, I'd like to bring in Ala and begin to talk with our audience who have questions. So Ala?
Thank you, David. I would like to start with thanking Brian, Dell, and Justin for taking us through this journey of memorials, the history from antiquity to present, and the Monuments Project, of course, Mellon Foundation's project, and of course, reimagining the commemorative landscapes. Our first question connects to the issue of equity. Equity starts in being fair to opening responsible spaces to our most needed voices, those from our indigenous people. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
I think it's open to the entire panel. So
I think it's more for Justin than me.
Sure. I mean, well, we've been, so for a quick note of background, the Monuments Project has served this broad reaching effort. And so we've been in conversations with a number of different people that are working to sort of correct, define, narrate histories that have been underrepresented. And that has included a number of indigenous and native peoples. The thing I will say is that some of the kind of assumptions and paradigms that many of us might think of aren't necessarily how many of those spaces are operating, right? Because there are connections to other issues and concerns and considerations about the broader work needed, in particular questions about equity and social justice and human rights that exist, right? So the work of the story, right? Like the different types of work and power dynamics. One is the work of the story is something that is engaged, but there are particular ways of thinking and navigating that work that are different from some of the contexts that those of us that have been sort of part of a certain paradigm in society are navigating. So it takes time, it takes conversation to explore those, but we have begun some of that work and will very likely soon in sort of the future rounds of this work be sharing some of those examples. But it's an important question, and there are other conversations this is connecting to about sovereignty and access to housing and all sorts of issues that monuments commemorative landscapes connect to that need broader conversations beyond only the monument or the commemoration.
Thank you so much, Justin. The other question we received from the audience, basically curious about the notion of centralizing the visitor contemplator of memorials. So feel free to answer this question, Del or Brian.
Well,
perhaps ask it again, Mellon. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Del.
No, go ahead. I mean, is the question how you do it? Is the question, does it happen? I think all monuments do centralize the viewer in the sense that they presume a certain relationship between the viewer and the monument, a tall pedestal, relationships of scale, and so on. So they do imply an expected response on the part of the visitor. They imply also, I think, a particular response. Do we want you to think this about this? I think what the monuments, the memorials Justin has talked about differ in that they suggest that people might have different responses to the space, might go through them in different ways. So they're attempting to be less authoritarian, I think, than traditional monuments are.
And I think in a lot of cases, it's the text that helps the visitor understand what they're looking at, because our visual vocabulary is not as precise in many respects as it once was, perhaps because we have too many visual stimuli. And so the text, in many cases, will tell you what the designers want you to think about the monument. And they'll also tell you, or in Antiquity, they would also tell you not to think about destroying the monument. Iconoclasm's been going on for the last 5,000 years. And when the Persian kings would set up monuments in Western Iran in 500 BC, they would always include a clause saying, you who are looking at this monument and thinking about it or destroying it, think again. Anyone who destroys this monument, let the gods destroy you and your family. So they knew that there would be an attempt to edit history in the future, and they were trying to forestall it by using the gods as a barrier, although it never worked.
That's a very interesting piece, because I think it really, the monument where there's a partnership of a guide and a viewer to share a story, the activation and the live retelling and storization of it is a beautiful sort of artifact of a new monument type of making. For all of our guests and our moderators, can you imagine, is this a new era of sort of reinventing what the action togetherness of memorization is?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, relative to that last point about the user, one of the things that we're seeing people experiment with is the hybrid of, let's say, the monument and the archive, for example, with a lot of the digital tools. So, Brian mentioned the text, but now there's sort of the hypertext that can connect you to the archive, for example, through a certain modality. And so there's different kinds of sort of infrastructure that can include collected stories, access to, let's say, collectively edited information that's sort of living in a way through some of those platforms. So that's something that's also being explored, and people are experimenting with things like augmented reality and kind of live interfaces that connect people in physical space and common space and shared spaces to another kind of commons. The jury is definitely out on that. A lot of these tools, are very early in their development. And so I think it remains to be seen, but it is a question that people are engaging and frankly, explicitly around the ability to have a living content in a way.
May I ask Justin a question that I think might open up some of the complexities of these projects? You were talking about the Raleigh Freedom Park. Raleigh has one. It has sort of on the edge of the city, a little park put together by a man named Bruce Leitner, who is a local funeral director, that has a statue of Martin Luther King, King larger than life size, but standing on the ground so you confront him individually. And it has a kind of strange Afrocentric, by way of Maya Lin, black marble thing that's supposed to represent African-American culture. Was that completely forgotten about in this process, or was it intentionally ignored, or was there some dissatisfaction with it?
Yeah, so the place and space matters, right? So we are kind of aware of the project, but the Freedom Park was an explicit effort or conversation around being sort of where other sites of power were assembled. So I showed that map at one point showing, you know, the governor's mansion, the assembly, the Capitol grounds, where all of the state's kind of collective memorialized landscape was being concentrated, and there was an absence there. And so the siting in that case was quite important and quite intentional by the people advocating behind that project. So a lot of the work that was done over that long period of time was to have site and presence at the site of power, right? And you know, you mentioned at one point the importance of it being in front of the Confederate monument being placed in front of the courthouse. That same conversation about power and access and participation was incredibly essential to the Freedom Monument team, which was a very kind of big, unwieldy kind of coalition of people. So the DC, the temporary commemoration pilot, that is also essentially about that same issue about the importance and power of a particular place, right? So what we call the national landscape, it's important what's on the mall versus what's not on the mall still, right? And so that's a part of a number of those conversations.
Allow me time for one last quick question, and then I'm going to try to conclude.
Yes, the last question is basically a central question, whether it's possible to democratize the process of commemorative creation without eventually turning into an imposition of the values of one group over others. How could this be curated, and how could it change typologies? And it's really open for all of you, Del, Brian, and Justin.
Well, I think it's a very difficult issue, not just because we're so polarized, but because the more people who are involved, the more points of view you have, and a good and bad thing about the presence as opposed to the 19th century is that in the 19th and early 20th centuries, a very small group of people had the power to say, it's going there, I'm paying for it, it's there, like it or leave it. Now, the more people who are involved, the more points of view you have, and you get messes like the 9/11 memorial, which was hijacked by certain groups of survivors. And it's almost impossible. It's impossible to get a memorial that is truly a consensus. I think any memorial is going to be a compromise of points of view.
I mean, if you're democratizing a monument, you're making it work for everyone. You're making it speak to everyone. I don't think you can do that. This gets into something I was saying in my talk. I don't know that you can do that with figural sculpture because that will restrict the accessibility of the design. You can do it with a list of names. That can work, which is why it's so frequently used for monuments in the 21st century and the late 20th century. But I'm not sure that we can do it anymore with figural decoration if we're democratizing it.
What happens when all the people who know the people on the list of names are dead?
Well, that's a legitimate
Think of the
question.
Civil War monuments that are listed.
So that actually, in an aspiration to wrap it up, I want to just take that last comment, which is we're coming to the end of an era, particularly associated with the Vietnam War, where those participants are beginning to become aged and not with us anymore. And what was fascinating about the original context of Mellon's proposal, which was not figurative, was this Jungian approach, right? You descended into Hades to see the shades and reflections of yourself in the context of the names of those who perished. And it was perished in chronological order. And so, and then you ascended like Orpheus once again to become a part of the real world. Changed, however. And so what I think is fascinating about the current era is that it perhaps, as Brian suggests, it's not perhaps just about names, but it's about experience. And that objectification may change to the context of experience, particularly as Justin's reference to the monument of listening, where the reflection is more broad, more inclusive in that. I just can only think that we're in perhaps a renaissance of our own, of our appreciation for where we are in this dialogue, that change is happening, right? And that it is an era of consciousness. And I think that you know, in opposition to this polarization that has taken place, we are self-aware, more self-aware perhaps, about our own role in this society.